Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. The show, as you know, brings you the libertarian perspective on events occurring around the world, and I'm joined as I am every week by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again for another round of Libertarian Angle.
It's good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in, and thanks for your comments after our shows. And if you're new to FFF, consider coming over to our website at fff.org. We publish a daily publication called the FFF Daily that we strive to make the best libertarian commentary page on the internet. We also have a monthly journal called Future of Freedom, and we have conferences and seminars, and of course this weekly internet show. Okay, Richard, I thought we would kind of take a little bit different tack this week and discuss a new book that has just hit the market, and that book is called For a New Liberalism, and you are the author of this book, and it's put out by the American Institute for Economic Research. It includes some essays that you wrote for the Future of Freedom Foundation. So I thought we would discuss this book. You tell us a little bit about it, and then we start interacting about it. The first question, though, I have for you is that the title of the book, Richard, I mean, I always thought that you were a libertarian, and yet here you are promoting leftism, liberalism. You know, what's happened here? I mean, have you gone over to the dark side? Explain to us the title of the book.
Well, I'll tell you, comrade. I have different view of things. Now, first of all, I think it's a very good-looking book. So please judge the book by its cover. But there might be a few things inside as well. And to more specifically answer your question, Jacob, I did this intentionally because I believe that liberal and liberalism are good words, which the left stole from the advocates and the defenders of freedom and liberty at the end of the 19th and especially during the early decades of the 20th century. Today we think of liberal, particularly in conservative or libertarian circles sometimes, we think of liberal as meaning someone who's an advocate of political paternalism, big government, someone who believes that it is the duty and the responsibility of the government to heavily regulate business, industry, interfere into social affairs for degrees of social justice, and to basically redistribute wealth, whether it be Social Security, health care, public housing, unemployment insurance, et cetera, the long list of those types of things. But this is in the sweep of things, a relatively new meaning of the word liberal. It became most popularized, this idea of political paternalism as being a liberalism, especially during the Franklin Roosevelt administration of the 1930s. The change had begun earlier, in the early 20th century during the progressive movement, when there was this idea that we needed to have a new sense of a liberal society. But it became most popularized with the New Deal and has remained so ever since, that it's become sort of a smear word or a critical word for those who are defined as we usually quote right of center. But in fact, the word liberal belongs to us. When the term became first popularized in the very early decades of the 19th century, the 1800s, 1810, especially after 1820, it meant an advocate of individual liberty, a proponent of private property and free enterprise, both at home and abroad, the reduction of government intrusion to people's lives, to basically the defender of rights and not the violator of individual rights, and the notion of an impartial rule of law under a limited constitutional order. And in fact, that was the outlook of the true liberals of the 19th century, whether it be someone like the followers of Adam Smith, a David Ricardo, a John Stuart Mill, though he's sometimes viewed as having socialist leanings, a Jean-Baptiste, Frederick Bastiat, the author of The Law, and so on. And then into the 20th century, those who still held the older liberal notions, such as Ludwig von Mises or Friedrich Hayek, for instance. And these liberals transformed the world. And as I point out in the first chapter about the ideas and the historical legacy of classical liberalism, as it now is more often called, there was an agenda of several, if I can just briefly mention them. First was the abolition of slavery. Since all of recorded history, it was presumed that people were meant to be masters and the masses were to be slaves. If in conquest, the victor did not kill you, he enslaved you to do things that you either could not do for yourself or you did not want to do for yourself. And this was taken for granted. Now, there were always visionaries who said, well, man should be free and it's somehow unnatural and undesirable. But this was the reality. It had nothing to do with race, ethnicity. A conqueror enslaved those he didn't kill, and as his compulsory and intergenerational people held in bondage to serve him. But beginning about 350 years ago, this began to change, particularly with the emergence of, as symbolized with John Locke's formulation of natural rights and natural law, that each individual by nature, from God and by his reason, has certain inalienable rights of life, liberty, and honestly acquired property, and that these are inviolable. This inspired the Declaration of Independence about a century after Locke wrote with the Founding Fathers. And in Britain, particularly in the second half of the 1700s into the 1800s, there emerged an anti-slavery league, because first Brits and then others came to say, if it is an abomination in the eyes of God and our own reason as human beings for one human being to hold another in this permanent bondage, then we should abolish this. And they campaigned, they espoused, they wrote books, monographs, they held public lectures, they started electing people to Parliament. And at the end of the day, with an act of Parliament in 1833, there came into effect in 1834 the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. That inspired the abolitionist movement in the United States, such people as William Lloyd Garrison, and others, or the famous runaway African-American slave who made it to the North and became one of the most outstanding spokesmen for the equality of all human beings and for the call of abolition, Frederick Douglass. He too was what we would consider a classical liberal today on these policy issues. And so their campaign brought about the end of slavery, this history-long institution, before the end of the 19th century. Their second campaign was rule of law and equality of rights before the law, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of occupation. And that slowly but surely began to triumph. The idea that government should be responsible to the citizenry, and the idea of the growth of a representative government, that government should be answerable to an electorate. And then, of course, economic freedom. The systems of government control and regulation should be abolished with an arena of free enterprise and cross-boundary free trade, which saw its triumph in Great Britain with the abolition of the Corn Laws in 1846 and a virtually opening by unilateral act of the Parliament to a regime of free trade throughout Britain and the British Empire with the rest of the world. And then finally there was the campaign for peace. And the attempt by the classical liberals in the 19th century, with some degree of success in the latter part of the 19th century, for governmental agreements on the rules of war, the rights of a POW, the respect and protection of the life and the property of those who were occupied by an invading country, that as long as they were not belligerents, their life and property should be protected even by the conqueror and recognized by the conqueror. And certain weaponry should be viewed as inhuman means of fighting wars, more in the principle than always the practice. But these were the visions of the classical liberals that transformed the world. End of slavery, all into personal freedom, civil liberties, representative government, economic freedom, peace and justice and harmony among nations. That transformed the world in the 19th century, Jacob. perfectly, consistently, completely? Of course not. But if there's a sense to the phrase, a spirit of the age, right, a sentiment among people, then that was liberalism in the 19th century, and it gave freedom, and it began to end poverty everywhere. One legacy of that, if I can mention this, Jacob, is that demographers and economic historians estimate that in 1820 there were 1 billion people in the world, and as best as they can estimate, between 85 and 90% of all those people lived in poverty, if not abject poverty. Fast forward to 2015, 2018. And this is by the statistics from those international organizations, including the UN, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization. Their data is that today the world's population is about 7.5 billion people, over a 7-fold increase. But in this 200 years, while the population of the world has been dramatically increasing, the rate of poverty, and especially abject poverty, has been plummeting. That the estimate by these international organizations is that poverty in the world today is only 10% of this 7-fold increase in the global population. And how has this come about? Because the freeing of markets, entrepreneurship, power of competition and incentives of profits and supply and demand and rivalry, peacefully, honestly, through the voluntarism of market exchange. And if this trend continues, Jacob, by the end of the 21st century, something that has been only a dream from humanity will see its end. Poverty. That image that we've been growing up with, those commercials on television by charitable organizations, where you see this emaciated child from Africa or Latin America with flies all over their face and they're starving. By the end of the 21st century, it is not impossible that will be gone. Will all people have the same standards and qualities of life? No. But that idea of poverty, of a parent or a person wondering, will I eat tomorrow? Will I live tomorrow? May very well be erased from the human condition. We should be hailing this liberal conquering of poverty through even partial openings to free market capitalism with hosannas. And instead, the left attacks this, Jacob. It attacks it. And that is part of what my book is meant to respond to reawaken a sense of what a spirit of liberty meant, with examples from the United States and our history from its beginning. What drove people to want to come to America and continues to attract them as immigrants? A land of freedom and opportunity without prejudice, without plunder, without persecution. Are we a perfect society? Were we a perfect society 150 years ago? Of course not. It's a matter of degree. To the extent that people understood and practiced the principles of liberty, it gave men dignity and rights and opportunities and prosperity. That is what made America the magnet that did and continues to draw so many people. I then explained the logic and the workings of a liberal market economy, liberal in the free market sense, how competition works, the fallacies about monopoly, the perversities of government regulation and intervention, the power of markets to overcome the difficulties of imperfect knowledge or asymmetric information so that cheating and fraud is minimized, and how many of the things that government does today, the government doesn't need to do and can be handed over to the private sector so that the state can be reduced to basically the protector of life, liberty, and property without the intruder into our affairs. And then I challenge, Jacob, many of the modern attacks of liberty, progressivism, political correctness, the gender and race politics warriors, and how they perversely want us to return to a primitive collectivism, that we are no longer individuals, Jacob, but crushed into a classification of a group. You are your race, you are your gender, you are your social group, and then political interest politics in democratic progressivism and democratic socialism to determine what your fate will be based upon the horse trading among collectivist groups in a statist political and social and economic environment. The reverse of all that liberty and liberalism attempted to free man from is to be returned through these perverse and dangerous totalitarian and dictatorial directions. And then finally, I turn to such questions as, why is capitalism hated? I have a chapter in which I try to explain the factors behind ignorance, arrogance, and envy. I explain what it means to be a liberal, not just in the advocacy of political liberty and economic liberty, but as a sense of life, how you should view your fellow man if you believed in the freedom and the dignity and the importance of the individual and viewing him as an individual above all else. And then I end the book, it's 400 pages long, I end the book with, in fact, an essay that I not too long ago wrote for FFF in the monthly publication Future of Freedom. I designed that to be my concluding essay for the book. And that is learning liberty and the power of principle. That each of us can be lights of liberty and need to be lights of liberty and spread the ideas with our fellow citizens as best we can, and to see the importance of being dedicated to principle. And however dark and depressing it may seem, if enough of us choose that course, freedom can be ours. Those are some of the themes and ideas and ways of thinking about a free society that I try to reawaken and offer in this book. And I hope that maybe a few of the viewers and listeners might be attracted to these ideas and maybe take the time to take a read through this book. It's available in two forms, if I can give myself that additional plug. It's available in paperback, Amazon for instance, for $18, or it can be acquired in a Kindle edition for a mere $5. And I offer it for your consideration, and I hope some of you find it attractive, as well as the nice looking cover.
Oh, well, you raise a lot of excellent points, and I want to hone in on a few of them. I mean, the principles you outline that we stand for and that we've been promoting much of our lives is now labeled as libertarianism. But your point is well taken. It used to be called liberalism. A lot of libertarians don't realize that we've become so accustomed to the word libertarian that we've never, a lot of people haven't learned that this used to be called liberalism. And that over time, especially starting with the progressive era, the left really stole the word, as you put it. They began adopting the word to describe their statist philosophies. And statist meaning that people who look to the state to solve social or economic problems that arise within society. And so gradually the word became corrupted. I mean, there's just no question about it. Now, in Europe and Latin America, people still use the word liberal to describe libertarianism. But here in the United States, the word liberal has come to be accepted as the statist philosophy. And what you're trying to do is rekindle this interest in what the word really once meant. But you also see this phenomenon now taking place with libertarianism. I mean, I consider libertarianism or classical liberalism to be a glorious philosophy, but it's a radical philosophy. There's a lot of people don't realize it. It truly is radical. I mean, the idea that a person should be able to keep all his own money, 100%, and decide for himself what to do with it is a radical notion, because it automatically negates forcible mandatory charity like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education grants, and so forth. And over the last several years, there's been many libertarians who have tried to water down these principles and compromise these principles to try to make them more palatable to other people. And in the process, they damage our brand. I mean, our brand is a certain set of pure principles of liberty. What does it mean to be free? And in the process of trying to expand their reach, they end up damaging the brand, and they end up hurting the very word and the meaning of the word that has meaning as far as us libertarians are concerned. Now, I'm glad you turned to the 19th century, because I feel the same way about the 19th century. I mean, there were a lot of bad things about the 19th century, but there are also certain positive principles that really told the world, this is the way if you want freedom, this is the way you get it. This is the direction that you point toward. And if you want to raise people out of poverty, We have discovered the solution here. The American people have discovered the solution. Because throughout history, people have struggled over poverty and how do we solve poverty and how do we get rid of poverty. Well, here the American people figured out the solution to this. I mean, well, beginning with Adam Smith's famous book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776, where the title itself is saying an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Okay, what is it that causes some nations to become wealthier than others? You hear the people on the left always talking about what are the causes of poverty. Well, poverty is the natural state. The question is, what causes wealth in a society? They think that wealth is given. I mean, I've noticed that some of these attacks on David Koch, the billionaire libertarian who recently passed away, and the attacks coming from the left are angry, and a lot of them orient around this concept of envy, that they just hate the idea that some people have more when other people have less. Well, there's a biblical injunction against that. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. When you start coveting what other people have, it's a highly destructive concept. That these people don't have less because David Koch had more. That's what they don't understand. They think that the reason they're not doing as well is because Koch was a billionaire. And you see the anger manifested in their attacks when they say, well, Koch opposed Social Security and Medicare and education grants, all the socialist programs that libertarians opposed. They say this shows that he was selfish. Yet here was a man that gave away hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, to hospitals, cancer research centers, opera houses, music centers, all this voluntary donation that he didn't have to do. I mean, a genuinely selfish person could just keep all the money for himself. Don't donate to anybody. Well, the left can't understand the difference between mandatory charity and voluntary charity. They think voluntary charity is bad. They criticize Koch on this. They say, oh, he didn't really mean it. He was trying to just cover up for his selfishness with all these voluntary donations. But here you have mandatory charity that characterizes the left and the right too, because they all believe in these socialist programs. And they don't see the immorality of using the state force to take money from a person to whom it belongs and give it to somebody to whom it does not belong. And it shows their lack of faith in freedom. That in a free society, which we believe in, we have no doubts that you can trust people to do the right thing, like David Koch donating to others and other people, middle-class people, donating to their churches and to worthy causes and so forth. So we don't have any doubts that you could eliminate Social Security today, Medicare today, and everybody would be fine. The children would step up to the plate and honor mother and father on a voluntary basis. Not everybody, but enough people would come forward. That's our conviction. But that's what the essence of freedom is about. That's the message that the 19th century Americans were sending to the rest of the world. Here was a society with no income tax, no Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Pentagon, CIA, foreign wars, coups, assassinations, drug war, immigration controls, very few economic regulations, no public schooling, no Federal Reserve, no paper money. It was a radical philosophy, but it was the cause of this tremendous increase in the standard of living of the American people. Now, were there bad things? Because I always get attacked when I talk about this by libertarians as saying, oh, you're saying the 19th century was a pure libertarian society. I'm not saying that at all. There was slavery. There was women didn't have the right to vote. There was the Sherman Antitrust Act that was coming into existence. There was a postal service. But imagine, Richard, if you take those exceptions to liberty and just eliminate them. Suppose in 1900, all that had happened was you eliminated the bad stuff. The women now had the right to vote. You didn't have the Sherman Antitrust Act. You didn't have the first Immigration Exclusion Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act. You get rid of all the Jim Crow laws, but you leave all the positive things in effect that were existing. No Federal Reserve, no income tax, no socialism, and so forth. It boggles the mind as to what the standard of living of people would be today in the United States. I mean, it'd be 1,000-fold higher than it is today. Instead, we went off in this leftist direction, the progressive direction with the giant welfare state. We went off in the statist direction with conservatives and Democrats with respect to the warfare state. And so all we end up with is destruction of liberty, destruction of genuine prosperity, booms and busts, inflationary bubbles, bursting bubbles, and everybody's unhappy with this dysfunctional society, including the left. They just blame it on free enterprise, when deep down they know that we're telling the truth, that this isn't a free enterprise society. This isn't a free society. This is a statist society that they have brought into existence by abandoning the positive direction, the trajectory that America was on, and that the solution to this whole thing is to get back on that trajectory toward freedom, peace, prosperity, which necessarily means a rejection of what the paradigm that both conservatives and liberals, in the perverted sense of the word, have brought to us. Whether we use the term liberalism in this classical sense, as you've titled your book, or libertarianism, it's the set of principles that matter on getting this country back on the right track.
Yeah, I think it's important to emphasize. You were saying that people, the left and others, look down upon voluntary charity and philanthropy, turning to the state. This is so different than the spirit of America in the 19th century. One of the chapters in the book highlights what America was like in the 19th century, the good and the bad, by looking at it through the eyes of foreign travelers who came to the United States. And to just give one example, though I quote from and refer to many of them in that chapter, one of the most famous, of course, was Alexis de Tocqueville, the French social philosopher who spent time traveling through the America of the 1830s, went back to France, wrote his famous book, Democracy in America. And I quote from a passage in which he said that one of the things that was most impressed upon him was the voluntarism of the American people. That whenever one or more people see that there's some social problem, difficulty, some cause worth espousing, they form these voluntary associations. It could be religious, it could be social, it could be political, it could be cultural, it could be a sort of community problem solving. But immediately people come together and form the voluntary associations that are the hallmark of the free civil society. And it was taken for granted. You don't force people into these things. You don't compel them to pay for things that they don't want. You see a problem, you persuade your fellow people, or you coalesce because you discover each other, and you proceed to act and solve as best you can these problems through these voluntary associations of civil society, in which people bring their ideas together, they offer their contributions of time and money and so on. And that this is viewed as the ethical avenue. You don't compel your neighbor to support or do things that they do not agree with, either the means or the end. If you talk to progressives and liberal Democrats, and unfortunately too many conservative Republicans, as you were alluding to as well today, there is a contemptuous disbelief. Is that, you can't rely upon private charity. People won't do the right thing. They're just greedy. And they're not talking about the Kochs. They're talking about any human being. There wouldn't be enough people. That's why the state has to, in its wisdom, of course, with people like them, whispering in the ears of those with political power, we have to compel all of our federal citizens to contribute the money so government can do the right thing to solve the social problems that people left on their own, which means in freedom. We never have put it for the interest of the willingness to approach and solve and coalesce to handle. See, it's that contempt for freedom, that disbelief in freedom, that is culturally and psychologically one of the most damaging elements in our society today. People have lost the belief in and the desire for and the confidence that a free society is possible in all of these aspects and avenues, which was the hallmark of that 19th century America, never seen before that, and unfortunately increasingly lost today. It is a glorious episode in the existence of mankind, of how society, which means we as individuals coalescing together for common purposes and ends, how society can come together to solve its problems or pursue its ends without force, but through the voluntarism of human choice. It's a glorious ethical model that unfortunately has gone down an Orwellian memory hole because of education and the media and propaganda and the contempt that the left, not alone, of course, conservatives, as we both said, but particularly the left has for a society of freedom, of leaving people alone to be guided by their own purposes and their own conscience.
Yeah, well, there's one exception with respect to these people who say that you can't have a free society because you just can't trust people to do the right thing in freedom. And there's always one exception when they say that. That exception is them. Because when you say, well, do you count yourself among these selfish, self-centered people that would not help out others if you were free? Oh, no. I'm different. I'm a good person. I would be able to do it, but everybody else is bad. Now,
exactly.
Yeah, go ahead.
You see, and that's why they believe that people like them should be in charge of the government. Well-meaning, looking beyond their own narrow, selfish interest in the common good, demigods, philosophic and ideological demigods, who, like on an Olympian cloud, must like Zeus, guide and direct and plan the society to get people to live and act and believe the right things, which left on their own, without us, would we lead to a society of plunder and poverty and discrimination and hardship, all the evils imaginable, if not for us. The hubris, the arrogance, what Hayek called in his Nobel lecture, the pretense of knowledge, just oozes from every fiber of their bodies.
Well, right, and using force, punishing people who don't want to participate in this whole thing. That you don't want to help out the poor? Well, send the IRS after them and put them in jail until you get your mind right. I want to make one final point before we wrap up, and that, a guy that really had a strong influence, I think, on every single libertarian, especially you and me, was Frederick Bastiat, the French free market legislator who his writings were absolutely brilliant, especially this little book called The Law. But one of his books was entitled Natural Harmonies. And I think it's so important to emphasize that because, the left creates this concept in people's minds that there's natural conflicts in society, the employer versus the employee, the employer's trying to exploit the worker, and you need a minimum wage law because otherwise wages would drop down to subsistence levels and so forth. Bastiat points out that it's actually the exact opposite. In a genuinely free society, in a free market economy, you have natural harmonies that take place among people, that employers and employees both have an interest in the success of the firm, that if the firm is successful, everybody benefits. That's how you get higher wages. There's also a vested interest in having other firms succeed in the marketplace, even competitive firms, because that gives workers the opportunity to go out and say, hey, maybe I can get a better job somewhere else, which tends to increase wages. There's a natural harmony with consumers. Even though consumers want lower prices, they will patronize the firms that provide goods and services that they want. So there's an opportunity for firms to try to satisfy consumer demand. So all of this is producing a higher standard of living over time. And so if we start thinking about that a market economy produces these natural harmonies, I think people then will have less fear of going to a free society and less fear of, oh my gosh, if we don't have a safety net or whatever, the society will collapse, everybody will turn selfish suddenly, and mankind will somehow plummet down the cracks. That instead, a natural harmony develops that increases the standard of living when you've got a free market society and a free market economy.
Yes, and that is why it is so important for us. In this final chapter in the book where I talk about learning liberty, besides Bastiat, another great inspiration for many of us, and I know you as well, was the founder and longtime first president of the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE, Leonard E. Read. And I mentioned in this chapter that I first attended a fee seminar back in June of 1974. I was a young whippersnapper. And it was a great week. The free market economist Hans Sennholz lectured as the free market journalist Henry Hazlitt. But I remember only one lecture from that evening, from that program. And that was an evening lecture given in the lecture hall by Leonard Read. And at one point, he had the lights turned off in the room. And he had a little electric candle. And he started turning the dimmer switch. Just a flicker of light. And he said, notice that even in this darkness, even this wee bit of light attracts all of our attention. And then he turned up the dimmer light more and more, and he said, "Notice as I turn up the electric candle, how more of the room is seen. You see me, we see people in the front rows." And then he kept doing this until finally it was at its maximum. And he said, "Notice that even this one candle lights up practically the whole room with just a bit of darkness in the corners." And he said, "That's what each of us can be. We can each be lights of liberty, illuminations for freedom." But that requires us to realize that if we want to change the world, the person that we have the most influence to begin that journey with is ourselves. We must be willing to take a little bit of the mantle of responsibility to become informed and knowledgeable about the ideas and the principles of freedom and their application. There's a lot of pulls and tugs in our life. We have family, friends, work. We just want to sit and watch a movie or a sports game on a Saturday. Understandable. He wasn't saying that we all become masters of this freedom philosophy, as he called it. But each in our own corner, in our own way, to the extent that we have time or interest to do so, must become knowledgeable about it, and in peaceful, polite, and courteous ways, when opportunities arrive with friends, families, co-workers, in a conversation or a discourse or some social setting over a meal, if these issues come up, to be willing to articulate and explain them to others in society, and slowly but surely get them interested until we have a field of illuminations of liberty, and the collectivism in society is pushed back into a few dark corners. And that was Reed's argument and position. Now, if I can just sort of add this again as a conclusion to this, Jacob, as an example for myself. When I first started teaching, I was still in graduate school. I was teaching a class at Rutgers University in New Jersey. But I was living in New York, so I would take the train back to New York after my class. I would sometimes stop at a little deli store to do some shopping before I went on to where I was living. And so I'm in this deli shop one day, and I'm on the checkout counter, and there's a woman behind me, and she's staring at me. And finally she says, "Aren't you Richard Ebeling?" "Yes." "Don't you teach economics at Rutgers?" "Yes." "You've ruined my marriage." Hell? And people start looking at me, and she repeats herself, "You've ruined my marriage."
Should we discontinue the show at this point, or do you want to go on with the story?
My husband took your class.
Oh, okay.
What he does now is come home, turn on the evening news, and spend the rest of the night complaining about government. "You have ruined my marriage." Now, Jacob, who was this guy? Did he sit in the front row, the back row? Did he ever ask a question? Did he earn an A? Did he earn a C? I have no idea who he was. But it shows that mine was the setting of the classroom. But whether you're having a conversation and it's the person you're interacting with, or someone who's overhearing you but may say nothing themselves, but some idea that you say rattles around in their head, you never know how your little light of liberty can influence someone in ways unimaginable. It's part of Albert J. Nock's essay, Isaiah's Job. And that is, you can't know the outcome or the effect you may have. Your responsibility as a person who cares about liberty is to articulate it and defend it and share it as best you can, and hope that it will be like the seeds that are planted in the right places until finally others join us in the winning of freedom and the displacement of collectivism. If we don't do it, our defeat is assured. If we do it, we have a chance to restore liberty and do away with the plundering and privileged collectivism under which we are increasingly living.
Yeah, all those are excellent points. I mean, Leonard Read was one of the most profound thinkers. I mean, my first published article as a libertarian was called Leonard Read Changed My Life, that was published in the Freeman. And anybody that's new to Leonard Read, I would highly advise you get every single book that you can buy the Leonard Read authored. That if you want to think at a very deep and profound level by reading really easy to read essays, Read will be the guy that'll do it for you. And you're right. I mean, you've got to stand on principle. That if you stand on bad ideas and you plant those ideas in somebody's mind, what good's that do? But this is what my beef is with people who water down libertarian principles. The reason you impacted that guy in your class at Rutgers was because you were expounding sound principles, and so it caused him to think. So you can sit here and think, oh well, nobody's listening to me, and that's why you bring up Isaiah's job in that essay by Albert J. Nock. Is that there are people that are listening. Sometimes you just don't know they're listening. But if you don't present those sound ideas, then they're going to be listening to bad ideas. In order to finally reach that critical mass that gets us to a free society, you got to stick with principle. You got to adhere to principle. All right. So on that note, Richard, need to wrap it up, and greatly enjoyed this conversation. The new book, Richard Ebeling for a New Liberalism, buy it at Amazon.com. And Richard, I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.
All right, and come visit us at FFF.org. See you all next week.